To understand the magnitude of the tragedy that struck Colombia during the 1990s, it is necessary to go back in time and travel to the geographical heart of the nation. We must place ourselves in the department of Quindío, specifically in the municipality of Genova. It is a region characterized by its staggering beauty, where the Andean mountains intertwine with endless coffee plantations, and where the fog descends the slopes like a white veil that conceals the secrets of the land. However, beneath that appearance of rural tranquility and agricultural prosperity in the mid-20th century, a silent storm was brewing that would forever change the criminal history of the country. It was there, in that contrasting setting, that on January 25, 1957, Luis Alfredo Garavito Cubelos was born, the eldest of 7 siblings in a peasant family that would soon become the first circle of hell for the future predator. It is imperative to analyze the historical context in which this child came into the world. Colombia was going through one of its bloodiest periods, historically known as La Violencia, the violence. It was a time when political brutality between liberals and conservatives bled the fields and normalized death as part of the everyday landscape. Life was worth little in rural areas, and this devaluation of human existence permeated not only partisan struggles, but also family dynamics. In the Garavito Cubelos household, violence was not a distant echo of the Civil War, but a palpable and daily reality personified in the figure of Manuel Antonio Garavito, the father. This man, described in later psychiatric reports and in the testimonies of the killer himself as a tyrannical and ruthless figure, represented absolute authority and terror. Luis Alfredo's childhood was not characterized by games or innocence, but by constant fear and submission. His father exerted despotic control over the family, using physical punishment not as an excessive corrective tool, but as a valve for his own frustrations and alcoholism. Documented accounts indicate that Manuel Antonio subjected his children, especially Luis Alfredo, to brutal beatings that often left visible physical marks and permanent emotional scars. The boy grew up seeing his mother, Rosa Delia Cubelos, as a subjugated figure, unable to stop her husband's rage, which planted in little Luis a seed of resentment towards weakness and a distorted understanding of power, where the strong subjugate the weak without consequences. From a forensic psychological perspective, experts who would later evaluate Garavito agree that these early years were fundamental for the fracturing of his psyche. The child learned to dissociate pain to survive. He became a silent observer of domestic horror, accumulating rage he could not express. The lack of paternal affection and constant humiliation created an emotional void he would later attempt to fill in the most grotesque way possible. However, physical abuse was not the only ordeal he had to endure. There is an even darker component in his early biography that marks the definitive turning point towards psychopathy. According to Garavito's own confessions and journalistic investigations that have delved into his past, sexual abuse appeared in his life at a very early age. It has been documented that he was not only a victim of his father's negligence and violence, but also of abuse by neighbors and family acquaintances. These episodes of rape that occurred during the vulnerability of his childhood destroyed any notion of bodily integrity or dignity he may have developed. It is crucial to point out that in the mind of a child, sexual abuse often translates into a terrible confusion between pain, pleasure, shame, and power. For Luis Alfredo, being used as a sexual object by other men taught him that other people's bodies are commodities and that pleasure is obtained through the domination of others. School was not a refuge for him either. In the educational environment of Genova, Luis Alfredo was seen as a withdrawn, strange child, often the target of ridicule. His erratic behavior and evasive gaze made him the target of bullying. His peers marginalized him, and this social exclusion reinforced his isolation. He felt different, not in a special sense but in a defective sense. Loneliness became his only constant companion. While other children played and developed normal social skills, Luis Alfredo began to develop a fantastical and dark inner world where he was not the victim but the aggressor, where he had the control that was denied to him in reality. As he entered adolescence, traits of an antisocial personality began to manifest more clearly. Alcohol consumption started at an alarmingly early age, facilitated by paternal example and the cultural environment of the region where aguardiente was omnipresent. Alcohol became a mechanism to numb the pain of memories and to liberate the inhibitions that kept him bound to social norms. Under the influence of alcohol, the young Garavito exhibited flashes of latent aggression, although still not directed towards murder. It is known that during these years he began to stay away from home for prolonged periods, wandering the rural roads and coffee plantations, learning to move stealthily through the rural geography, a skill that would later prove lethally useful for his modus operandi. The environment of the coffee plantations of Genova, with its dense vegetation and broken terrain, provided him with the perfect hiding place. There he could observe without being seen, could spy on others, could fantasize without interruption. The nature surrounding him, beautiful and lush, became for him a stage for imaginary hunting. It is important to highlight that during this stage of pre-adolescence and early adolescence, Garavito's mind was already devising forms of retribution against the world. However, his rage still lacked a specific target and a refined method. He was a ticking time bomb with the clock mechanism activated, but without an immediate detonator. The relationship with his father reached an inevitable breaking point. The beatings did not cease, and Manuel Antonio's contempt for his eldest son intensified as he saw him become a problematic alcoholic teenager. In Garavito's psyche, the figure of the father merged with the figure of the oppressive masculine authority. Some analysts suggest that in his later crimes, Garavito was not only seeking to satisfy his sadistic impulses, but also unconsciously recreating the power dynamics he experienced in his childhood, but reversing the roles. He became the all-powerful and cruel father, and his victims took the place he had as the helpless and terrified child. This compulsive repetition of trauma is a common characteristic in many serial killers, and in Garavito's case, the connection is undeniable. The family's economic situation also played a determining role. Poverty forced children to work from a young age in field labor, depriving them of educational opportunities and personal development. Luis Alfredo worked as a coffee collector and in various jobs, experiencing firsthand the harshness of rural working life without protections or guarantees. This precariousness, combined with his emotional instability, led him to develop a class resentment, a dull hatred towards those he perceived as privileged or happy. However, his future victims would not be the rich or the powerful, but the most vulnerable. The children of the poor, those who, like him, were invisible to society. The time came when life in Genova became unsustainable. At the age of 16, with his soul already corroded by resentment and his mind populated by perverse fantasies, Luis Alfredo Garavito made the decision to leave his parental home. It was not a heroic departure in search of a better future, but a desperate escape from a past that was suffocating him. He left his house with little more than what he was wearing and with an immense psychological burden that he would carry for the rest of his life. This exit marked the end of his stage as a passive victim and the beginning of his transformation into a nomadic predator. Leaving behind the coffee plantations of his childhood, Garavito threw himself onto the roads of Colombia. He became a vagabond, a being without roots who learned to survive through deception and manipulation. The street became his new school, and there he perfected the arts of disguise and lying. He learned to read people, to identify their needs and weaknesses. He discovered that a kind smile and a promise of help could open doors that direct violence kept closed. It was during this period of wandering that he began to construct the mask of kindness that would allow him to approach his victims without raising suspicion. The analysis of his geographic profile shows us that his initial displacement was not random. He moved through the regions of the coffee axis and the Valle del Cauca, areas he knew culturally and geographically. He mingled with the floating population of seasonal workers, a demographic group where anonymity is the norm, and where no one asks too many questions about the past of a stranger. This social invisibility was his greatest asset. Garavito understood that for Colombian society, a poor and solitary man was practically non-existent, and he decided to use that indifference to his advantage. It is essential to emphasize that although at this early stage, the wave of systematic homicides that would make him infamous had not yet been unleashed, the foundations of his criminal behavior were already solidly established. The lack of empathy, malignant narcissism, impulsivity, and the need for control were traits already present in his personality. Criminal behavior experts point out that during these years of youth, Garavito likely committed minor offenses and assaults that were never reported or were lost in the inefficiency of the judicial system of the time. They were the general rehearsals of a macabre play that was about to premiere. Leaving Genova also meant the definitive separation from any figure of moral or legal authority. Without the supervision of his family, however dysfunctional it was, and without a community attachment, Garavito felt free from any ethical ties. His moral compass was completely broken, if it ever worked. In his distorted mind, the world was a hostile place where only the most cunning and cruel survived. He decided to be both. The road offered him a blank canvas, and he chose to paint it with the suffering of others. As he walked the dusty roads of Colombia, observing children playing by the roadside or working selling sweets at toll booths, something dark was solidifying within him. He no longer saw those children as equals or as human beings with rights. He saw them as opportunities. He saw them as objects to satisfy his repressed desires and to avenge his own stolen childhood. The transformation was almost complete. The frightened child from Genova was dead, and in his place walked a potential monster searching for the moment and the place to land his first lethal blow. Thus concludes this first chapter of the story of the beast. We have traversed the green paths of his origin, looked inside the house of terror where he grew up, and witnessed the systematic destruction of his innocence. But this is just the beginning. The darkness that was born in the coffee plantations of Genova would not remain confined there. It would spread like a patch of black oil, covering towns and cities, leaving in its wake a trail of unimaginable pain. In the next chapter, we will delve into the formative years of the killer, exploring how he perfected his modus operandi, and how the blind and indifferent society allowed him to take his first steps towards the abyss without anyone noticing the danger lurking in the shadows. The making of the predator was ready, and the first and visible victims were already in his sights. The transformation of Luis Alfredo Garavito from a traumatized young farmer to one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history did not happen overnight. It was a slow and corrosive process, a simmering of his basest instincts, fueled by impunity and social indifference. After leaving his home in Genova, Garavito immersed himself in the anonymity of Colombia in the 1970s and 1980s. During these dark decades, the country was rocked by the growth of drug trafficking and internal armed conflict. Amidst the deafening noise of bombs and assassinations, the silent figure of a man walking along back roads went completely unnoticed. It was in this national chaos where the beast found its perfect camouflage, perfecting the art of being a nobody in order to be everything in the eyes of his victims. It is crucial to understand the psychology of the predator at this stage of development. Criminal profiling experts suggest that during these wandering years, Garavito began to experiment with his fantasies. It was no longer enough for him to imagine control, he needed to exert it. Alcohol became his main fuel. He did not drink to socialize, but to unleash the monster that resided within him. Under the effects of aguardiente, a type of alcoholic beverage, his already fragile moral barriers crumbled completely, allowing his sadistic impulses to take the wheel. However, unlike other impulsive criminals, Garavito possessed a calculating cunning that differentiated him and made him infinitely more dangerous. He learned to compartmentalize his life, separating the violent drunk from the kind and helpful citizen he presented to society. It was during this period that his modus operandi was born, the most lethal tool in his arsenal, the disguise. Garavito understood that brute force attracted unwanted attention, while persuasion and deception guaranteed the voluntary submission of his victims, at least until it was too late. He began to build characters. He realized that in a deeply Catholic society that respected traditional hierarchies, certain figures inspired automatic trust. Thus, his multiple identities were born: the kind priest, the traveling monk, the representative of charity foundations, the elderly man in need of help, or the man offering well-paid work. This chameleonic ability was not merely a change of wardrobe, it was a complete method acting performance. Garavito studied the vocabulary, gestures, and intonation of the people he imitated. He carried religious cards, notebooks, and false credentials that he made himself with obsessive meticulousness. This preparation denotes a chilling level of premeditation. We are not talking about crimes of opportunity arising from a momentary outburst, but of coldly planned hunts executed with executive composure. The goal was always the same, to gain the trust of vulnerable children and adolescents to lure them into his trap. But who were these early victims? Aquí entramos en uno de los aspectos más dolorosos y vergonzosos de esta historia, la invisibilidad social de los objetivos de Garavito. El asesino eligió a su presa con precisión quirúrgica basada en su falta de protección. Se centró en los niños de la calle, los llamados. Camouflage is an evolutionary strategy found in nature where the most lethal predators adopt the appearance of their environment or even mimic harmless species to approach their prey without triggering survival instinct alarms. In the Colombian criminal ecosystem of the 1990s, Luis Alfredo Garavito elevated this biological concept to a form of macabre art. The chapter we address today is perhaps the most unsettling of this entire saga because it forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Evil does not always have a monster's face. Sometimes evil wears the face of a kind, elderly person asking for help to carry some bags, or the understanding smile of a religious figure offering comfort. Garavito perfected what is known in criminal psychology as the halo effect, a cognitive bias whereby we tend to attribute positive qualities like kindness and honesty to individuals who present a pleasant or authoritative appearance. He understood that to hunt in broad daylight amid crowded squares and bustling transportation terminals, he needed neither firearms nor brute strength. He needed trust. To understand the mechanics of his deadly trap, we must dissect his wardrobe of costumes, both physical and psychological. Garavito was not an improvisational actor. His characterizations were the result of acute sociological observation. He knew that in deeply Catholic rural and semi-rural Colombia, the figure of a priest or monk was untouchable. Therefore, one of his favorite identities was that of Father Toño, or simply a wandering missionary. He would let his beard grow, wear modest clothing, sometimes an improvised tunic, and always carried with him the indispensable accessories of the staging: a worn Bible, a rosary around his neck, and cards of the Virgin of Carmen or the Divine Child. With this attire, he would stroll through the central parks of the towns, blessing passers-by and projecting an aura of sanctity that disarmed any suspicion. Who could imagine that beneath the habit of a servant of God lurked a child killer? But Garavito's repertoire went beyond religion. He also understood the economic desperation that afflicted the families of his victims. Hence, he alternated his mystical disguise with that of a representative of charities or non-governmental organizations. He presented himself as an official responsible for helping street children or unemployed youth. He carried tense folders and notebooks filled with false notes. These notebooks were a key piece of his props. In them, he wrote fictitious names, lists of supposed beneficiaries, and offers of non-existent jobs. When he approached a minor, he would show the notebook as proof of his legitimacy. The geography of Colombia is often described in terms of its lush biodiversity and breathtaking landscapes. In the west of the country, the Cauca Valley extends like a flat, fertile emerald green carpet bordered by mountain ranges, where sugarcane sways under the unrelenting sun of the tropics. Further north, ascending the Andean slopes, lies the coffee axis, a region of rolling mountains, perpetual fog, and coffee plantations that fade into the horizon. During the 1990s, this strip of land connecting the south with the center of the country was the scene of enviable agricultural and tourism prosperity. But beneath the surface of this idyllic postcard ran a subterranean river of blood. This region, blessed by nature, became the private hunting ground of Luis Alfredo Garavito, transforming into a vast open-air cemetery where death traveled by intercity bus. To understand the magnitude of the carnage that took place in this geographic corridor, it is essential to analyze the mobility of the killer. Garavito was not a static criminal. He did not operate from a fixed hideout to which he returned every night. He was a traveling predator, a shark who needed to move constantly to breathe and to kill. The Cauca Valley and the coffee axis offered him the perfect infrastructure for his macabre logistics. The road network connecting intermediate cities such as Palmyra, Buga, Tuluá, Cartago, Pereira, Armenia, and Manizales is dense and fluid. There is a constant flow of people and goods, a perpetual circulation that allows an individual to disappear in one city and reappear in another within hours. Garavito became an expert in routes and schedules. He knew every transportation terminal, every informal stop, and every shortcut between municipalities. His office was the road, and his work schedule was permanent. Let us begin the descent into this hell via the Cauca Valley. Here, the flat topography and the suffocating heat played a crucial role in hiding the crimes. The immense sugarcane fields that cover much of the department are green walls 3 meters high, impenetrable to the view from the road. Within these sugarcane fields, a microclimate of total isolation is created. The sound of the wind in the leaves drowns out the screams, and the density of the planting hides the bodies. Garavito used these sugarcane fields as natural torture chambers. He would take his victims under the pretext of searching for treasure or cutting through to a supposed estate. Once inside, the child was completely at the mercy of the beast, isolated from the outside world by kilometers of monotonous vegetation. In cities like Tuluá and Buga, reports of missing minors began to accumulate alarmingly but silently. Families, often from low socioeconomic strata, would initiate desperate searches that crashed against a wall of institutional indifference. It is heartbreaking to review the local press archives from that time and find brief notes on judicial pages about macabre discoveries in the sugarcane harvests. Agricultural workers, the cane cutters who entered to harvest, encountered nightmarish scenes, small bodies in an advanced state of decomposition reduced to bones by scavenger animals and the voracious climate. At that time, these discoveries were treated as isolated cases. Talks of settling scores or satanic rituals or simply the endemic violence of the region were common. No one was able to see that those bones scattered across different municipalities belonged to the same sinister puzzle. As Garavito moved north, reaching the northern part of the valley and entering the coffee axis, the landscape changed, but the horror remained constant. In Cartago and Pereira, the topography becomes more rugged. Here, the sugarcane fields give way to ravines, steep slopes, and areas of thick underbrush. Garavito adapted his modus operandi to the terrain. If in the valley he used the horizontal expanse of the sugarcane, in the coffee axis he utilized the verticality of the chasms. He would take children to the outskirts of cities, to peri-urban hillside areas where the city unravels and becomes wilderness. There, in hard-to-reach hollows, he committed his crimes. The broken geography made it extremely difficult to find the bodies. Many remains were left hidden under the underbrush on slopes where no one walked, remaining invisible for years or perhaps forever. The forensic analysis of the bodies eventually recovered from this region reveals systematic brutality and the signature of the killer. Although information was not centralized at the time, we now know that the patterns were identical. The corpses showed a very specific type of binding. Garavito did not tie at random. His knots had a complexity that indicated practice and a sadistic intent. Hands were frequently found tied behind the back and linked to the ankles or the neck, forcing the victim to maintain a painful and impossible posture. Additionally, the skeletal remains spoke of extreme postmortem or perimortem violence. Cutting marks on the cervical vertebrae indicated decapitation or deep throat slitting. Fractured skulls, broken ribs. It was not just murder, it was annihilation. It was as if the killer wanted to erase not only the life, but the humanity of the victim. It is important to note that this enters the realm of investigative hypothesis, but it is believed that Garavito's choice of this region also obeyed a component of cultural familiarity. He was from Quindío, knew the idiosyncrasy of the coffee people. He knew how to talk to them. He was aware that in Paisa culture, kindness is the norm, and distrust is considered rudeness. He exploited the hospitality of the region. He moved through the towns of Quindío like Genova, his hometown, Montenegro, and La Tabaida with a smoothness that made him invisible. For the inhabitants of these towns, he was just another local, a man trying to make a living. This cultural mimicry was his most effective shield. No one suspects the neighbor who speaks with your same accent and shares your same customs. The social context of the 1990s in this area also served as a smokescreen. The Coffee Axis and Northern Valley were permeated by the influence of drug cartels. The Norte del Valle cartel was in full swing, and its war with other factions generated a homicide rate that saturated morgues and prosecutors' offices. The appearance of corpses in rural areas was sadly commonplace. When the body of a young person was found, the first police hypothesis was usually social cleansing or revenge between gangs. This stigmatizing prejudice played in favor of Garavito. Authorities assumed that the victims were involved in something shady, and thus did not investigate thoroughly. The innocence of the murdered children was smudged even after death by an official narrative that criminalized poverty. Testimonies collected years later paint a bleak picture of those days. Peasants reported seeing a strange man walking with children along the paths, but did not intervene out of fear or respect for others' privacy. Mothers recounted how their children left to run an errand or to play soccer and never returned, as if the earth had swallowed them. There are heart-wrenching accounts of parents who wandered hospitals and morgues across 3 departments searching for a sign, a trace, a piece of clothing. The uncertainty was an added psychological torture. Not knowing whether their children were alive or dead, whether they had been recruited by the guerrilla, or whether they had run away from home. Garavito not only killed the child but also killed the peace of entire families, condemning them to an eternal and unresolved mourning. In Pereira, the capital of Risaralda, the situation reached critical levels. The city, with its large transportation terminal and its bridge under construction, was a magnet for transient populations. Garavito settled in cheap lodgings in the city center. From there, he operated with chilling impunity. He could be seen in the parks and depressed areas inviting children to eat ice cream or watch movies. Some survivors who managed to escape his clutches at this stage describe a man who changed moods suddenly, going from laughter to tears or to anger in seconds. These flashes of instability were ignored. The city was too busy growing and surviving to pay attention to a harmless madman. The frequency of attacks in the Coffee Axis accelerated. The beast was in a frenzy. The cooling-off period, that psychological pause that serial killers tend to have between crimes, practically disappeared. There were weeks when Garavito killed several children on consecutive days or with very little interval. He moved from Pereira to Armenia in the morning, killed, and by afternoon he was already in Manizales or Cartago, looking for the next victim. This criminal hyperactivity suggests a total loss of control over his impulses. He no longer killed for refined pleasure, he killed out of physiological need, like an addict urgently needing his dose. And yet his luck or cunning continued to protect him. A determining factor in his impunity was the lack of communication among departmental authorities. The police of Valle did not share their databases with those of Quindío or Risaralda. For an investigator in Tuluá, the discovery of a decapitated child was a local case. He had no way of knowing that in Armenia, 100 kilometers away, a colleague was lifting a corpse with the same characteristics. Garavito crossed the invisible boundaries of police bureaucracy with the same ease as he crossed toll booths. He took advantage of a fragmented and blind system. Each department saw a point on the map, but no one saw the line that connected them. The bodies found in this region posed an additional forensic challenge. The fauna. In tropical and woody areas, the action of insects, birds, and mammals destroys soft evidence in a matter of days. Many of the children found were little more than scattered skeletons by the time authorities arrived on the scene. This made it impossible to accurately determine the cause of death in many cases or recover bodily fluids for DNA analysis, a technology that was also nascent and costly in Colombia at that time. Nature involuntarily became an accomplice of the killer, erasing his traces and leaving only the silence of the bones. Despite the carnage, Garavito continued to lead his double life. In the towns where he stayed, he attended mass and befriended the parish priests. There are chilling anecdotes of how he came to collaborate in parish activities, surrounded by children, while in his mind, he reviewed the details of his last crime or planned the next one. This capacity for dissociation is what terrifies the psychiatrists who have studied his case the most. He was not a monster lurking in the dark. He was a monster living in the sunlight, capable of looking a mother in the eye and smiling at her knowing he had just murdered a child who could be her son. The blood trail he left through the valley and the coffee axis is a geographic scar that will never fully heal. It was in this region where the number of victims skyrocketed exponentially. It is estimated that more than half of his confirmed crimes occurred in this corridor of death. It was here that he perfected his technique, where he felt most comfortable, and where society failed his childhood most spectacularly. The coffee plantations and sugarcane fields, silent witnesses of the barbarity, kept the secret for too long. But the land cannot hide the blood forever. The accumulation of bodies, the obsessive repetition of the ritual, and the sheer volume of tragedy would eventually have to break the dam of silence. The end of his reign of terror in western Colombia was approaching, not because the police were close to capturing him through intelligence, but because his own greed would lead him to make mistakes. But before that, the beast would decide to change hunting grounds. Perhaps feeling that the air was becoming thick in the coffee axis, or simply driven by his nomadic spirit, Garavito set his sights on other regions. However, what he left behind in the valley and the coffee mountains was a lost generation, a generational gap marked by the absence of hundreds of children who never grew up to be men. In the next chapter, we will move to the moment when the truth began to come to light. We will travel to Pereira, where the mass discovery of graves and skeletal remains uncovered the magnitude of the horror and forced authorities to accept the unthinkable, that a single man was hunting Colombia's children. The discovery of the graves and the horror in Pereira will mark the beginning of the end for Garavito's impunity, but also the start of a national trauma that will haunt us forever. The criminal history of a nation often has turning points. Precise moments when reality breaks and what was believed impossible materializes before the astonished eyes of society. For Colombia, that moment came in the late 1990s in the green and humid slopes surrounding Pereira. Up until that point, the disappearances of minors were treated as cold statistics. Isolated events disconnected from each other, and often attributed to the youth's own will to leave their homes or to forced recruitment by illegal armed groups. But the land has memory. And in Pereira, the land decided to speak. What began as a routine discovery quickly turned into a descent into an abyss of horror that no forensic investigator, no police officer, and no citizen was prepared to face. This chapter narrates the moment when the magnitude of the beast was revealed. Not by its physical presence, but by the immense necropolis it had silently built under the noses of the Risaralda capital. The geographical context is vital to understand how such atrocity could be concealed. Pereira is a vibrant commercial city and a mandatory stop in the coffee axis. Its periphery, however, is a complex mix of urbanization and wild nature. Deep ravines, areas of dense underbrush, and small streams surround the popular neighborhoods, creating invisible borders where civilization ends and the Andean jungle reclaims its space. It was on these margins, in sectors like La Villa and the areas adjacent to the road leading to Armenia, where the secret began to be unearthed. It all started almost accidentally, as major discoveries in crime reporting tend to occur. A farmer or a passerby wandering through a wooded area of difficult access noticed something that did not fit the landscape. It wasn't the smell. Time and the elements had done their work of decomposition, but a shape. Some remains that appeared human protruding from the underbrush and the garbage. When notifying the authorities, the Technical Investigation Corps of the Prosecutor's Office, CTI, arrived at the site expecting perhaps to find one more victim of common violence. A settling of scores in the drug trade that was staining the region with blood. What they found, however, defied all conventional criminal logic. As they cleared the vegetation, forensic experts stumbled upon a small skeleton. From the dimensions of the long bones and the skull, they immediately knew it was a child or an adolescent. The tattered and dirty clothing still adhered to the remains, told the story of a humble life. But what chilled the investigators' blood wasn't just the child's death, but the way it had been left. The wrists were tied with an unusual complexity. It wasn't a simple knot made in haste. It was a sadistic, elaborate binding designed to immobilize and cause pain. Near the body, they found other items, mismatched shoes, scraps of fabric, and an atmosphere of evil that seemed to pervade the air. As the forensic experts processed that first scene, horror multiplied. When they expanded the search perimeter just a few meters away, the disturbed earth revealed another body, and then another, and one more. This wasn't an isolated crime. They were standing on a clandestine cemetery, within a radius of a few kilometers, on those steep slopes overlooking the indifferent city. Dozens of corpses began to appear in various states of skeletonization. The scene was horrific. It was as if a predator had used that specific place as its macabre pantry or personal dump. Investigators, seasoned by the violence of the armed conflict, had to pause to vomit or cry at the magnitude of what they faced. These weren't combatants. These weren't criminals. They were children. The analysis of the crime scene in Pereira became the cornerstone of the investigation against Luis Alfredo Garavito. Although at that moment they still did not have a name, the experts began to notice irrefutable patterns linking all the findings. The modus operandi was screaming from the graves. All the bodies belonged to males between 8 and 16 years old. All showed signs of extreme violence. Many had their cervical vertebrae severed, indicating decapitation or a deep cut in the neck made with a very sharp weapon. But the most distinctive signature, the psychological fingerprint of the murderer, was the bindings. The use of shoelaces, nylon ropes, and plant fibers to tie hands and feet was identical in each case. It is important to note that this enters the realm of reconstructive hypothesis. But it is believed that CTI investigators in Pereira, upon seeing the obsessive repetition of these knots, understood they were not facing a gang or a social cleansing group. They were facing a single mind. An organized, methodical, and deeply disturbed mind. The consistency in the execution of the crimes suggested a ritual. The killer didn't just kill, he fulfilled a specific fantasy over and over again. The positioning of the bodies, often left in humiliating postures or exposed in a certain way, indicated a total disdain for the victim and a desire to extend his dominion even after death. The news of the discovery of the graves in Pereira spread like wildfire. Although it was initially handled with secrecy to avoid hindering the investigation, however, the rumor of the monster began to permeate the lower neighborhoods. Mothers who had been searching for their missing children for months or years crowded into the facilities of legal medicine. The morgue in Pereira became the epicenter of national grief. The task of identification was titanic and heartbreaking. At a time when DNA testing was not routine or quick, forensic experts relied on dental morphology, clothing, and personal items found alongside the bones to name the victims. Let us imagine for a moment the scene in that morgue. Entire families entering a cold room to look at tables filled with dirty clothes and bones, hoping not to recognize that soccer jersey or those patched sneakers their child wore the day they did not return home. Each positive identification was a tragedy but also a cruel relief. At least they knew where their child was, but for many others, the uncertainty continued. The advanced state of decomposition of many bodies and the actions of scavenging animals made it impossible to identify all the remains. Many of those children recovered from the slopes of Pereira ended up in common graves, identified only by a number. Anonymous victims of a silent massacre. The psychological impact on the team of investigators was devastating. A special group was formed, led by prosecutors' office officials, who understood they had a moral mission beyond their legal duty. They decided they would not rest until they found the responsible person. They began to draw a map. They marked every point where a body was found. In doing so, they clearly saw the route of death. The points were not randomly dispersed. They followed the lines of the roads and rural paths. They concentrated near transport terminals and depressed areas. The geographical profile of the murderer began to emerge. A mobile man who knew the terrain, who moved on foot and used the rugged topography to conceal his crimes during the excavations and the lifting of the bodies. Clues were also found that spoke of the killer's life: empty liquor bottles, tubes of lubricant, candy wrappers. These everyday wastes mixed with death painted the portrait of a man who took his time. He was not a flash killer. He was someone who lived among his victims before and after the crime, someone who drank alcohol at the scene. Perhaps celebrating his work, criminal profilers began to speak of a sadistic psychopath with traits of necrophilia and fetishism. Someone who kept trophies. The absence of identity documents in most of the bodies suggested that the murderer took them. The Society of Pereira reacted with a mix of panic and denial. It was hard to accept that, in such a Catholic and traditional city, a being of such darkness could operate. Theories of all kinds emerged: organ trafficking, satanic cults, political conspiracies, but the truth was simpler and more terrifying. It was a single man. A man who walked among them. Testimonies began to fit together. People remembered having seen a strange priest or a lame old man walking with children toward the areas where the bodies appeared. The figure of Father Tonio or the monk began to gain strength in the files. Witnesses described a kind man with a soft voice who inspired trust. That description contrasted so violently with the brutality of the forensic findings that it was hard to believe they were the same person. The discovery in Pereira not only revealed bodies. It revealed the systemic flaws of the Colombian state. It exposed the vulnerability of poor childhood. How could it be possible that 20, 30, or 50 children disappeared in a single city and no one had sounded the alarm before? The graves in Pereira were a slap in the national conscience. They forced us to look at those street children that everyone ignored, and to realize that their invisibility was what had killed them. If they had been children of politicians or businessmen, the search would have been immediate. But as they were children of no one, the murderer had years of advantage. The pressure on the prosecutor's office increased. It was no longer about investigating disappearances. It was about hunting down the most prolific serial killer in the country's history. Data was crossed with other regions. Investigators from Valle del Cauca and other departments in the Coffee Axis began to share information. When they put the maps on the table, they realized that Pereira was not a unique case. It was merely the epicenter of a much larger earthquake. The patterns of bindings and decapitations found in Pereira were identical to unsolved cases in Tuluá, Armenia, and Cartago. The beast was everywhere. This chapter of the discovery in Pereira is crucial because it marks the shift from impunity to pursuit. It was the moment when forensic science and the tenacity of a few officials managed to piece together the devil's puzzle. The bones spoke. And what they said was clear. There is a predator on the loose who is intelligent, ruthless, and will not stop unless stopped. The collection of evidence in these graves allowed, for the first time, the isolation of biological fluids that would eventually, years later, serve for DNA matching. But at that moment, in 1998, the strongest evidence was circumstantial and behavioral. The horror experienced by the teams lifting corpses on those steep slopes left scars. Many of them recount years later how the smell of death stayed ingrained in their skin and in their memory. They tell of recurring nightmares with the children's shoes, with the toys found in the mud. It was an experience that also robbed them of their innocence. They understood that absolute evil exists and that it takes human form. The number of open files in Pereira overwhelmed the judicial capacity. Each folder was a truncated life, a story of pain, and an accusation against the society that allowed it to happen, while the city tried to process the trauma and families buried their children's incomplete remains. The killer was no longer there, true to his nomadic nature. Garavito had sensed the heat of the investigation or simply exhausted his hunting ground in Risaralda. He had moved, but this time he left behind a trail that was too visible. The discovery of the graves was the mistake that would eventually cost him his freedom. By concentrating so many crimes in such a specific geographical area, he allowed the authorities to see the magnitude of his work, his arrogance in believing himself untouchable, in thinking he could fill the mountains with corpses without consequences. Was his Achilles heel. The Genesis investigation, as it would unofficially come to be known, gained strength. CTI detectives, with the image of those children burned into their retinas, swore to catch him. They already had a profile. They had a modus operandi. They had physical descriptions of the disguises. They only needed a name and a current location. The hunt had ceased to be a blind search to become a strategic pursuit. But the monster was still on the loose and still hungry, far from stopping. His spiral of violence would continue eastward towards the endless plains where he thought he could hide again. In the next chapter, we will follow the steps of the beast as it fled to Villavicencio. We will see how, despite the tightening noose, he managed to claim new victims in a race against time. We will analyze the blind hunt and the fatal mistake in Villavicencio. The moment when his excessive confidence and a minor oversight finally put him face to face with justice. The discovery in Pereira was the scream of the victims. What came next would be the law's response. The darkness was about to meet its end. But the cost had already been immeasurable. El vuelo hacia el este no fue un acto de cobardía, sino una maniobra táctica de un depredador que siente que su territorio de caza ha sido comprometido. Después de esparcir terror en el eje cafetero y el valle del Cauca. Luis Alfredo Garavito dirigió sus pasos hacia los llanos orientales. Una vasta región de infinitas sabanas, atardeceres ardientes. Y una cultura ganadera donde el hombre solitario es una figura común en el paisaje. Villavicencio, la capital del departamento del Meta, se convirtió en su nuevo objetivo. Conocida como la Puerta de los Llanos. Esta bulliciosa ciudad comercial servía de punto de conexión entre los Andes y la selva amazónica. Para Garavito, representaba un lienzo en blanco. Un lugar donde su rostro era desconocido. Y donde las noticias de las tumbas en Pereira llegaban como un eco lejano distorsionado por la distancia y la guerra. Sin embargo, lo que el asesino no sabía era que la causa ya había comenzado. No era una persecución con sirenas y perros de rastreo tras de él, sino una causa ciega. Una red de inteligencia tejiéndose lentamente en las oficinas de la fiscalía. Conectando hilos invisibles entre departamentos. En los primeros meses de 1999, la presión sobre las autoridades colombianas era inmensa. Aunque silenciosa, los investigadores del CTI que habían trabajado en las exhumaciones en Pereira sabían que enfrentaban a un monstruo errante. Habían logrado establecer un perfil criminal sólido. Buscaban a un hombre de mediana edad con acento paisa. Probablemente con alguna discapacidad leve para caminar o simulando una. Que a menudo se disfrazaba de figura religiosa o de persona en situación de calle. Pero Colombia es un país grande y accidentado. Y buscar a un hombre sin nombre en medio de una población desplazada por el conflicto armado era como buscar una bruja en un pajar en llamas. La orden de arresto era un fantasma legal contra una persona indeterminada. Mientras tanto, Garavito, ya asentado en Villavicencio, continuaba su ritual de muerte con una compulsión que desafiaba toda lógica de autopreservación. Es imperativo analizar el estado mental del asesino en esta etapa final de su libertad. Los psicólogos forenses sugieren que Garavito había entrado en una fase de desorganización progresiva. La meticulosidad que caracterizaba sus crímenes en el Valle del Cauca comenzaba a mostrar fisuras. Su apariencia física se deterioraba. Ya no siempre se molestaba en mantener impecables sus disfraces de sacerdote y oficial. A menudo se le veía sucio y desaliñado. Mezclados más con los habitantes de la calle que configuras de autoridad, esta degradación no disminuyó su letalidad, por el contrario, lo hizo más volátil y peligroso. La necesidad de matar se había vuelto tan urgent que acortó los tiempos de seducción y aumentó los riesgos que estaba dispuesto a asumir. En Villavicencio, el modus operandi se adaptó al entorno llanero. Garavito frecuentaba áreas marginales cerca del río Guadiquía y los espacios abiertos alrededor de la terminal de transportes. Ali se acercaba a niños que trabajaban vendiendo café, lustrando zapatos o simplemente deambulando. La promesa seguía siendo la misma de siempre. Dinero fácil, ayuda para cargar cargas o propinas generosas. La pobreza seguía siendo su mayor aliada. A pesar de que su apariencia era menos pulida, su capacidad de persuasión verbal se mantenía intacta. Tenía ese maldito don de la palabra que podía convencer a un niño de que él. Ese extraño huesucio hombre. Era su única oportunidad de ganar un poco de dinero ese día. Sin embargo, la suerte que lo había acompañado durante casi una década estaba a punto de agotarse. El 22 de abril de 1999 marcó el principio del fin. Ese día, en un sector desolado cerca del barrio La Grama en Villavicencio, Garavito intentó secuestrar a un menor. Pero esta vez, algo salió mal, la víctima no era tan dócil. O quizás el instinto de supervivencia del niño se activó demasiado pronto. Hubo resistencia. El niño gritó, luchó y se negó a ser amarrado. Esta lucha rompió la burbuja de control absoluto que Garavito solía imponer. El rito atrajo la atención. Es crucial entender el contexto social de la época en Villavicencio. La inseguridad era alta. Y la comunidad estaba cansada del crimen. La justicia de mano propia era una constante tentación ante la ineficacia policial. Cuando algunos transeúntes y taxistas vieron a un hombre mayor forcejeando con un niño en un matorral, no pensaron en un asesino en serie. Pensaron en un violador o un ladrón común. La reacción fue inmediata y furiosa. Un grupo de personas rodeó a Garavito. Lo golpearon, lo insultaron. Y estuvieron a punto de lincharlo allí mismo. La suprema ironía de esta historia es que la policía llegó para salvarlo. Los oficiales que intervinieron rescataron a ese vagabundo golpeado de la ira popular. Sin saber que estaban protegiendo al mayor criminal de la historia de la nación, Garavito fue llevado a la comisaría no como el monstruo de Genova, sino como un simple indocumentado acusado de un intento de abuso o agresión a un menor. En ese momento, su identidad era un misterio. Cuando fue interrogado, activó su última línea de defensa, la mentira patológica. Se identificó con un nombre falso, Bonifacio Morera. Hizo como si estuviera loco. Actual como un pobre diablo confundido, murmurando incoherencias y retratados como una víctima de una cruel sociedad. Su actuación fue tan convincente que inicialmente, las autoridades locales lo consideraron un caso psiquiátrico menor. Un problema de orden público más que judicial. Pero aquí es donde entra en juego la evidencia material que celeria su destino, el carriel. Ese viejo bolso de cuero que nunca se separó de él, y que la policía confiscó en el momento de su captura. Si Garavito hubiera tenido la frialdad de deshacerse de esa bolsa, podría haber sido liberado en pocas horas debido a la falta de pruebas contundentes sobre el intento de asalto. Pero no lo hizo. Su narcisismo y fetichismo lo traicionaron. El carriel contenía su vida secreta. Cuando se abrió, los investigadores no encontraron solo basura perteneciente a un vagabundo. Encontraron una colección de horrors, Dentro de la bolsa había elementos que hicieron sonar las alarmas de un fiscal perspicaz en Villavicencio. Había trozos de cuerda de nylon idénticos a los usados en los atamientos de cuerpos encontrados en Pereira y el Valle. Había cuchillos. Había recortes de periódicos sobre crímenes y desapariciones. Pero lo más incriminatorio eran los cuadernos y gráficos de control. Garavito llevaba un macabro registro de sus actos. Mantenía listas con nombres de niños, apodos, lugares y fechas. También guardaba fotos de identificación de muchas de sus víctimas. Pequeños trofeos de papel que tomó de las billeteras de niños muertos o que encontró en su ropa. Esas fotos eran los rostros de los desaparecidos que Media Colombia estaba buscando. La conexión entre el vagabundo arrestado en Villavicencio y la investigación nacional Genesis no fue automática. Requirió la intervención de inteligencia policial. Al revisar las pertenencias y notar la extraña colección de fotos y nombres. Los funcionarios de Villavicencio contactaron la sede en Bogotá. Podría ser este el hombre. La descripción física coincidía vagamente. Pero la evidencia en la bolsa era demasiado circunstancial para ignorar. Las huellas dactilares y fotografías del detenido fueron enviadas a expertos del CTI que lo habían estado siguiendo durante años. El momento de la confirmación fue eléctrico. Al comparar las huellas dactilares del supuesto Bonifacio Morera con los pocos registros existentes de Luis Alfredo Garavito. Un hombre con un historial delictivo menor y una vida errante. El sistema arrojó un resultado positivo. No era solo un loco cualquiera. Era él. La Bestia estaba en una celda en Villavicencio, detenida por un delito menor mientras los tumbas de Media Colombia gritaban su nombre. La transformación de Garavito durante los interrogatorios iniciales es digna de estudio. Al principio, mantenía su máscara de inocencia y locura. Negó todo. Dijo que los artículos en la bolsa no eran suyos y que los había encontrado. Pero la presión psicológica de los interrogadores fue implacable. Usaron técnicas de entrevista cognitiva. Confrontándolo con la evidencia física y contradicciones en su relato. Le mostraron que sabían más de lo que él pensaba. Le hablaron de Pereira, Tuluá, los nudos y los cortes. Gradualmente, la máscara de Bonifacio Morera se desmoronó, revelando al verdadero Luis Alfredo. Es importante señalar que esto entra en el terreno de la hipótesis sobre su motivación para confiar. Pero muchos expertos creen que Garavito no confesó por remordimiento, sino por vanidad. Cuando se dio cuenta de que lo habían descubierto, sintió una necesidad perversa de reclamar la autoría de su obra. No quería ser visto como un mero abusador fallido de Villavicencio. Quería que supieran quién era realmente. Quería que reconocieran la magnitud de su crimen. Comenzó a soltar detalles que solo el asesino podría conocer. Lugares exactos de los cuerpos, posiciones específicas en las que los había dejado, palabras que las víctimas habían dicho antes de morir. La confesión no fue un torrent inmediato. Fue un goteo calculado. Garavito negociaba. Pedía beneficios penitenciarios, protección, un trato especial a cambio de revelar donde estaban los niños. Es sabía que la información era su única moneda de cambio. Los investigadores tenían que jugar su juego. Sitiendos frente al monstruo, escuchando sus horripilantes historias sin perder la compostura. Todo con el objetivo de recuperar los cuerpos y dar cierre a las familias. Era una danza macabra entre la justicia y el puro mal. Mientras tanto, fuera de las paredes de la comisaría y la oficina del fiscal, las noticias comenzaban a filtrarse. El rumor de que el asesino de niños había quedado se difundió por Villavicencio. La indignación pública creció. Hubo intentos de violencia de masas, la gente quería arrastrarlo y lincharlo. Las autoridades tuvieron que reforzar la seguridad. Trasladarlo con extrema precaución. La integridad física de Garavito se convirtió paradójicamente en una prioridad para el Estado. No para proteger su vida per se, sino para proteger la verdad que ocultaba, si moría en un linchamiento. El secreto de la ubicación de cientos de cadáveres moría con él. El error fatal en Villavicencio no fue solo el intento de secuestro fallido. Fue la arrogancia de creer que podría seguir operando indefinidamente. Fue la negligencia de llevar consigo la evidencia de sus crímenes como si fuera un álbum familiar. Ese viejo wisuquio carriel se convirtió en la caja de Pandora que, al abrirse, liberó a todos los demonios de la última década en Colombia. La captura en los llanos orientales cerró el ciclo de libertad del depredador. Pero abrió un nuevo capítulo que era igualmente doloroso, el de la verdad judicial y la rendición de cuentas. La sociedad colombiana tuvo que confrontar la realidad de que el hombre que veían en las noticias, maniatado y con la cabeza agachada, no era un extraterrestre o un demonio sobrenatural, era un hombre corriente. Uno más colombiano. Un producto de la misma violencia y abandono que él perpetuó. La banalidad del mal se hizo presente en cada noticiero. ¿Cómo podía alguien tan insignificante en apariencia causar tanto dolor? Ese cuestionamiento resonaría en la conciencia colectiva durante años. Con Garavito bajo custodia, la fase de casa terminó. Y comenzó la fase de excavación y reconocimiento. El asesino se convirtió en el guía de su propio cementerio. Llevando a los investigadores a lugares remotos para descentrar el pasado, pero antes de llegar a ese punto de macabra colaboración. Hubo un duelo de mentes en las salas de interrogatorio. Un duelo donde la verdad tenía que ser extraída con forceps de una mente laberíntica y manipuladora. En el siguiente capítulo, profundizaremos en esa sala cerrada. Escucharemos la voz de la bestia confesando sus pecados ante la justicia. Analizaremos cómo se desarrolló el proceso judicial. Cómo logró manipular el sistema para obtener reducciones de penas. Y cómo sus frías y detalladas palabras terminaron trazando el mapa del horror que había dibujado sobre la piel de Colombia. La confesión de la bestia ante la justicia será el testimonio definitivo de la oscuridad humana. The four walls of an interrogation room are often the scene where a criminal's career ends, but in the case of Luis Alfredo Garavito, those walls became an auditorium. After his capture in Villavicencio on April 22, 1999, and the subsequent confirmation of his identity through fingerprint matching, one of the most complex and disturbing judicial processes in Latin American history began. We are not simply talking about a man admitting a crime, we are talking about the opening of an encyclopedia of horror narrated in the first person with a coldness and administrative precision that morally disarmed the officials in charge of guarding him. The beast no longer ran through the cane fields nor hid behind monk disguises. Now he was sitting in a plastic chair, handcuffed to a metal table, ready to negotiate his secrets in exchange for benefits, perhaps driven by a narcissistic need to be recognized as the author of the largest body count the country had ever seen. The atmosphere in the offices of the National Prosecutor's Office, where the first inquiries took place, was one of electric and suffocating tension. The investigators knew they had the right man. The evidence in his backpack and the geographical patterns screamed it, but they needed his voice. They needed him to fill in the gaps that forensic science could not reach. They needed to know where the other bodies were. Garavito's initial strategy was silence and stubborn denial. He maintained his role as a victim of the system, claiming it was all a setup, that he was a man of God, and that the accusations were slanders. However, the CTI, Technical Investigation Corps, profilers, and the prosecutors assigned to the case quickly understood that they could not interrogate him using conventional intimidation tactics. Garavito did not respond to fear, he responded to respect and validation. It was then that the dynamic of the interrogation changed radically. A team of prosecutors experienced in criminal psychology was appointed, opting for an empathetic approach, a risky but necessary technique. They treated Garavito with ceremonial courtesy. They offered him coffee, decent food, and they listened to him without visibly judging him. This validation was the master key. Garavito, a man who had felt marginalized and humiliated throughout his life, suddenly found himself the center of attention of the most important people in the law. That attention fed his inflated ego. Slowly, the barrier of denial began to give way. The breaking moment was not an outburst of tears or remorse, it was a cold and calculated negotiation. Garavito asked what he would gain if he spoke. He knew the penal code. He was aware of sentence reductions for confession and effective collaboration. When he was guaranteed that his rights would be respected and that the law would be applied with all its procedural benefits, the dam broke. What came out of his mouth in the following weeks and months was a torrent of atrocities recounted with the calmness of someone dictating a shopping list. The prosecutors and writers had to take turns listening because the emotional burden of his words was unbearable for a single person. Garavito not only confessed to having killed, he described the process with such a level of detail that it eliminated any doubt about his authorship. He spoke of the knots. He explained with technical pride how he tied the children in a specific way to completely immobilize them and cause them pain if they tried to move. He described how he deceived them, what he told them, what he offered them. He revealed that his memory was prodigious. He remembered dates, times, the weather that day, the clothing his victims wore, and in many cases their names or the nicknames with which they introduced themselves. It is imperative to analyze the psychology behind this confession. The experts monitoring the sessions noted that Garavito relived the crimes as he narrated them. His eyes shone, his posture changed, sometimes he smiled slightly while recalling a particularly successful deception maneuver. There was no remorse in his tone. There was satisfaction. He viewed his murders not as acts of evil, but as achievements, a series of completed missions in which he had proven to be more cunning than his victims and than society. He often tried to justify his acts by blaming external factors. He invoked the devil, said that a dark force possessed him when he drank, or blamed the victims themselves, suggesting that the children were malicious or that they brought it upon themselves. This neutralization technique is common among psychopaths to protect their self-image, but in Garavito's case, the moral disconnection was absolute. The confession did not remain in words. In order for the collaboration to be effective before the law, Garavito had to guide the authorities to the burial sites that had not yet been discovered. This is where what the press called, when the hammer of justice finally fell on the judge's table to seal the fate of Luis Alfredo Garavito, the sound did not bring the relief that the nation expected. Instead, it resounded like a hollow echo that exposed the deep fractures of a legal system designed for men and not for monsters. After the marathon of confessions and the horrific geographic journey to recover the bodies, it was time to translate barbarism into the cold language of criminal codes. This final chapter of the saga is not about the bloodshed in the cane fields, but about the ink spilled in the court records, and how the architecture of Colombian laws at the end of the 20th century clashed frontally with an evil that exceeded any legislative foresight. The story of Garavito's conviction is a painful paradox. The greatest serial killer in the country's history technically received a millennium-long sentence, but in practice faced a countdown that terrorized society for more than 2 decades. To understand the collective outrage that followed the trial, it is imperative to break down the judicial mathematics of the case. The Attorney General's office was able to consolidate evidence and confessions to charge Garavito with 138 counts of homicide, in addition to kidnapping, torture, and violent sexual assault. If the maximum penalties for each of these crimes were added individually, as is done in judicial systems like that of the United States, the resulting figure would challenge human longevity. When the judges arithmetically totaled the convictions, they reached a theoretical figure that exceeded 1,853 years in prison. 1,853 years. A figure that on paper seemed to deliver justice for the magnitude of the child genocide perpetrated. However, the Colombian legal reality was very different. The penal code in force at that time established an insurmountable constitutional limit. The maximum sentence of imprisonment could not exceed 40 years, regardless of the seriousness or the number of accumulated crimes. This principle, known as the concurrence of crimes, meant that although Garavito had killed 1,000 children, the state could only physically detain him for 4 decades. But the situation was even more complex and exasperating for public opinion. Because Garavito accepted a plea bargain, that is, he accepted the charges and cooperated with locating the bodies, the law automatically granted him a substantial reduction in his sentence. From the initial 40 years, the effective sentence was initially reduced to 24 years. And on those 24 years, the prison system offered additional reductions for work, study, and good behavior. The news that the child predator could regain his freedom in a relatively short time frame fell like a bomb on the families of the victims. The feeling of impunity was devastating. How was it possible that the life of each child was worth only a few months in jail in the final calculation? The mothers who had buried bones instead of bodies felt that the system mocked their pain. A furious national debate erupted over the need to amend the Constitution to introduce life sentences for child rapists and murderers. The Garavito case became the central argument of this legislative struggle, a shadow that loomed over Congress and the courts, forcing the country to reconsider the limits of human rights in the face of crimes against humanity. While the controversy raged in the streets and in the media, Garavito was transferred to his new home, the Valledupar Medium and High Security Prison, popularly known as La Tramacua. This prison, located on the Caribbean coast, is famous for its extreme conditions. The heat is suffocating, the infrastructure is harsh, and it houses the most dangerous criminals in the country. There, in an isolated cell to protect him from the prison population that would undoubtedly have killed him instantly, Garavito began his life as Colombia's most infamous inmate. His behavior behind bars is a fascinating and disturbing study of the adaptability of a psychopath. Far from collapsing or showing genuine remorse, Garavito tried to replicate his manipulation strategies within the prison walls. During his first years of confinement, he portrayed himself as a model prisoner. He studied, worked to the extent possible within his isolation, and maintained impeccable disciplinary conduct. He knew that every day of good behavior was one day less of his sentence. But what was most unsettling was his supposed spiritual transformation. Garavito began to preach. He declared himself a converted Christian, claimed to read the Bible daily, and stated that he had been forgiven by God. He even asked to be called pastor. Forensic psychologists and analysts who followed his case saw this as an extension of his disguise. The same religious camouflage he used to hunt children in parks he was now using to try to gain public sympathy or at least to convince the parole judges of his rehabilitation. The interviews he gave from prison to renowned Colombian journalists are audio-visual documents that chilled the audience's blood. In them, one could see a man who, though aged and with graying hair, maintained that glassy and calculating gaze. When asked about his crimes, his speech oscillated between technical acceptance and delirious justification. He often blamed alcohol, the devil, or even insinuated that society and state neglect were the true culprits. Never was there a sincere tear for the parents' pain. His narcissism remained intact. He saw himself as an important figure, someone whose story deserved to be told and heard. The coldness with which he recounted the details of his murders in front of the cameras demonstrated that the monster had not died, it was merely caged. Over the next 2 decades, Garavito's name periodically resurfaced in headlines, causing waves of social panic. Every time he completed a fraction of his sentence, his lawyers or public defenders would request parole, arguing that he had already paid his debt according to the rules of the game at the time of his conviction. This news generated mobilizations, protests, and strong statements from the Attorney General's office and the government. It became a matter of state. No official wanted to be the one to sign the release of the beast. The parole judges, under immense social and moral pressure, found legal mechanisms to systematically deny his requests. They argued that he had not paid the multi-million-dollar fines imposed as reparations to the victims, money Garavito obviously did not have, and that psychiatric reports indicated a high risk of recidivism. Psychopathy is not curable, and the latent threat that he would kill again was a strong argument for keeping him locked up. Time, however, began to exact its own toll on the body of the killer. Human justice might be imperfect, but biology was relentless. In his later years, Luis Alfredo Garavito's health visibly deteriorated. The man who once walked tirelessly through the Colombian mountains, hunting innocents, became a frail and sickly old man. He was diagnosed with chronic leukemia, and later with aggressive ocular cancer that deformed his face. The images that leaked of him during his transfers to clinics showed a being consumed, with an eye patch and skeletal thinness. For many, this physical degradation was seen as a form of divine or karmic justice, a decay that reflected the corruption of his soul. It is important to note that this enters the realm of ethical reflection, but there was a debate about the medical attention he was receiving. Some sectors of society question why the state spent resources treating the cancer of a man who had taken so many lives without mercy. However, the health and prison system fulfilled its legal duty to keep him alive, demonstrating a humanity that he never had for his victims. Garavito spent his last months between the prison infirmary and hospitals in Valledupar, under strict surveillance, not for risk of escape, but because he remained the most hated prisoner in the country. The final outcome came on October 12, 2023. At the Nueva Santo Tomas Clinic in Valledupar, Luis Alfredo Garavito's cardiac monitor stopped. He was 66 years old. The news of his death spread across networks and news outlets, not with sadness, but with a strange feeling of closure and contained relief. There was no national mourning. There were no vigils. There was a dry confirmation that the biological nightmare had ended. The beast had died of natural causes in a bed, a peaceful death that violently contrasted with the agony and terror he imposed on the nearly 200 children who died at his hands. The solitude of his death was absolute. For days, his body remained in the morgue of Medicina Legal in Valledupar, without anyone coming forward to claim it. No family, no friends. Even in death, Garavito was a pariah. Eventually, it was revealed that a nephew handled the arrangements for his cremation, perhaps to prevent his grave from becoming a site of desecration or a macabre place of pilgrimage. His ashes were scattered in anonymity, just as he tried to scatter the remains of his victims. It was the gray and lonely end of someone who believed he was the master of life and death, but the killer's death does not erase the scar. The legacy of Luis Alfredo Garavito is an open wound in the memory of Colombia. His case forever changed how the country protects its children. It forced us to look into the abyss of social neglect and to acknowledge that indifference kills as surely as a knife. The controversial 40-year sentence that never came to be fully served due to the prisoner's death remains a reminder of the limitations of human justice in the face of absolute evil. Laws can punish, but they cannot repair the irreparable. Today, as we look back at that decade of darkness in the coffee fields and on the highways, we must not remember the name of the executioner. His name should fade from the clinical history of infamy. What must endure is the memory of the children. Of those who sold candies, of those who carried bags, of those who dreamed of a better future and found the trap. They are the true protagonists of this painful story. Garavito's death closes the court case, but the moral debt of Colombian society to its vulnerable childhood remains valid. Thus concludes the chronicle of the shadow over Colombia. We have traveled from the origins of evil in Genova to the cold cell in Valledupar. We have looked into the face of the abyss, and the abyss has returned our gaze with a terrible lesson. The monster lives among us, disguises itself as goodness, and feeds on our silence. May this narration serve not only as a record of the facts, but as a permanent alarm cry. Never again indifference. Never again forgetfulness. Peace be upon the tomb of the innocents.
If you liked this video, subscribe to the channel, activate the little bell, and give it a like. This way, you will help more people discover the story behind every mystery.
Here ends the journey through the dark paths of Colombian geography. But the echo of Luis Alfredo Garavito's footsteps will not easily extinguish from our collective memory. Together, we have traversed the chronology of an infamy that challenges our moral understanding. And we have faced the abyss of human negligence. As we close this file, we are left with a bitter taste. A feeling that human justice is merely a superficial bandage over a wound that reaches the bone. The death of the beast in a hospital bed, far from offering a definitive closure, leaves us with unsettling questions about the nature of evil and the fragility of the structures that should protect us. Garavito was not an accident of nature, nor an inexplicable anomaly. He was the product of a perfect storm where trauma, abuse, social indifference, and a system unable to see what was right before its eyes were mixed. It is vital to reflect on the legacy of this story. We must not remember the executioner with fascination, nor allow his name to become a dark legend. What we must preserve is the warning that his existence has etched in fire within us. Evil does not always present itself with sharp fangs or a grotesque appearance. In the case of Garavito, evil disguised itself as humility, religiosity, and service. It took advantage of the needs and trust of the most vulnerable. It taught us that the most dangerous predator is one who knows how to read our shortcomings and blends in with the surroundings until it becomes invisible. The almost 200 children who lost their lives in the cane fields and ravines are not mere figures in a legal document. They are truncated lives, futures that never came to be, and a permanent reminder that as a society we failed in our most sacred mission, that of caring for those who cannot care for themselves. The story of true crime, however, is a river that never stops flowing. As we close the file on Genoa and leave behind the treacherous green landscapes of the Andes, another shadow begins to stretch on the horizon. Evil is a chameleon that adapts to any culture, geography, and social stratum. If Luis Alfredo Garavito was the monster of the margins, the predator of the forgotten, the case we are about to open will take us to the opposite extreme of the social spectrum. We will move from the dusty roads of Colombia to the well-paved highways and university campuses of the United States. We will leave behind extreme poverty to delve into the aspirational middle class in a world of apparent privileges where no one believed that terror could knock on their door. Get ready, because in our next encounter, we will face a different type of darkness. We will not speak of a dirty vagabond hiding in the bushes, but of a man who walked under the sunlight with a charming smile and a promising future. We will talk about a law student, a political aspirant, a handsome and articulate man who could have been your neighbor, your classmate, or the perfect boyfriend, if Garavito exploited pity and religious authority. Our next protagonist exploited charm and feigned vulnerability. He used a false cast on his arm and a rehearsed smile to ask for help from young, intelligent women, who would never have followed a stranger if he had not seemed harmless and attractive. We are about to enter the labyrinthine mind of Theodore Robert Bundy. Ted Bundy, a name that has become synonymous with modern psychopathy. Unlike Garavito, whose violence was crude and rural, Bundy represents urban and sophisticated terror. His hunting ground was not lonely fields but university libraries, state parks and fraternities. His story will force us to question the idea that we can identify a murderer by their appearance. Bundy showed us that the monster can have the face of an angel, and that the mask of sanity can be so perfect that even those who sleep beside him are incapable of seeing the beast that dwells beneath. We will analyze how he managed to evade the police across several states, crossing borders and changing identities with astonishing ease. We will see how his narcissism led him to defend himself in court, turning his trial into an unprecedented media spectacle where fans gathered to see him smile. We will unravel his necrophilic obsession and the cold, calculating rage that drove him to hunt women who represented everything he desired and everything he hated. The case of Ted Bundy is not just the story of a serial killer. It is the definitive study of manipulation, arrogance, and the human capacity to compartmentalize life to the point where reality becomes unrecognizable. If Garavito's story chilled your blood due to the brutality and the number of his victims, Bundy's story will disturb you because of its psychological proximity. It will make you look twice at that friendly stranger offering you help in the supermarket, or at that car that stops beside you on a dark street. Because if there is one thing these two cases, so distant in geography yet so close in evil, teach us, it is that danger is a silent companion that travels with us in our daily routine. The transition from the horrors of the coffee axis to the nightmares of Seattle and Florida will be a change of scenery, but the essence of fear remains intact. At Mysteria, we do not just tell stories, we dissect darkness to try to understand it. Our commitment is to take you beyond sensationalist headlines and immerse you in the deep psychology of the protagonists and the context that allowed their crimes to occur. The journey has only just begun. The list of shadows is long, and every file we open is another piece in the complex puzzle of the human condition. We do not want you to be just a spectator. We want you to be a conscious witness to these realities that, although painful, are necessary to understand the world we live in. That is why I invite you not to remain on the threshold. The investigation into Ted Bundy promises to be one of the most exhaustive and revealing we have conducted to date. We will dust off files, listen to tapes, and reconstruct the steps of the man who defined the term